Hi everyone and welcome to this overview tutorial of VisusCity Volume 2 for Unreal Engine 5.4 and up. This is a tool I've created mostly for myself for architectural visualization to quickly populate a background if you have a project with some buildings and houses and foliage in the background. But it can also be used for developing games and etc. So, a starting point, I'm going to just show the folder structure quickly. Or, let me just show you the project settings if you want to migrate this project into your own existing project. Okay, so in your own existing project, the most important thing is to make sure under the plugins, you have to have the PCG framework, content generation framework, plugin activated in your existing project. From there, if you've opened up this project, you can just right click on the VisusCity folder and click migrate, select OK, and select a content folder of your own existing project. So for instance, if I want to take it to this project, I go to mountain, I go to the content folder and select that folder to migrate over to that project. Okay. And that's a basically important thing. And I'll go on if I remember something else. So folder structure, from here you'll see the assets. Assets basically all the smaller parts is your buildings, the foliage, the homes, the houses and the roads. Everything under the assets folder. The levels, this is the main level that it opens up the project with, the VisusCity demo. And then under it I've created the asset levels. You'll see the default lighting, it's for the sky and the sun. This level gets loaded into each level just to create the clouds and the sun, and then on your outliner you'll also see it right here, default lighting, which is your usual atmosphere and lighting settings for each level. And then I've got a level to show all the 12 buildings, a level to show the 10 foliage actors and the 12 houses and all the road blueprints level right there. Alright, materials is all just the basic general materials that gets used all over. From here you'll see, for instance, the pond and the pool material, basic materials, and for the dummies colors that I've used here. And of course the master PBR material is under there. That gets used all over. Right, and then for the city PCG, just the city, not the roads, you'll see the PCG folder right here. You'll see the main graph is the PCG VisusCity main PCG graph for more of the developers which wants to know how everything is put together and want to reverse engineer or change certain things manually. It's right there. And with each data asset and each nodes. Again, this is just to do with the city blueprints, not the road blueprints. I'll show you a little bit later on where those are. Render settings. These are just for my exports of the sequences. This console variable, if you're in a new project, you can just perhaps double click this console variable. It will load all the console variables necessary, for instance, for the trees not disappearing on a distance, certain nanite settings, certain LID settings right here. You'll see them under the session. It will load it up if you're not seeing what I am seeing. Basically that. And on the templates, here's basically the blueprint templates. The main BPV VisusCity is right here. And then I've created two for a dense building and a sparse building. If you'll see in this scene, you'll see it right here, the dense buildings I've made on the left side. They both are basically the same blueprint as the main default blueprint, but just with different parameters, whereas this one only creates buildings, pretty dense buildings, and then this blueprint creates a bit sparser buildings and more houses. just with different parameters set up right there for you. The global variables is only just one variable that just turns on or off the road lines. Basically, which I mean about that is these little yellow, white road lines. You can turn that off with a global variable right there, just to turn that off and on if you need it for all the lines, for all the roads and lines and bridges. But you can turn it off and on separately for each road section or bridge section or intersection, etc. I'm going to disable the two blueprints of the dense buildings, so to start over from scratch. So as you can see, for my navigation wise, because this is a huge city, you'll see I'm moving slowly. So while I'm doing this is holding in the right mouse button with your AWSD keys. And then another trick is while you hold the right mouse button and, for instance, the W key, and you scroll your mouse wheel up or down, you can increase or decrease the speed of your movement. Thus, I have got faster movement and I don't have to move so slowly. Again, it's while holding the right mouse button and either AWSD keys and rolling your mouse wheel up or down to increase or decrease the speed of your camera movement. I don't know if you guys know about that. If so, good. So under the dense buildings, I'm going to VisusCity all. Um, Sorry, let me just show under the BP. You'll see four sections: VisusCity inner, which is the buildings; VisusCity all is the general; outer is the houses; and foliage is the trees. Under the VisusCity all, I'm just going to disable the buildings and the foliage for that blueprint, and I'm going to do the same for the sparse building. VisusCity all, disable the buildings, disable the houses, and disable the foliage, just to get a little bit more speed for this tutorial. And then these foliage actors are actually foliage tool that I use just to paint some foliage around in areas where the PCG graph didn't fill in for where I needed for this project. So now by disabling those two parameters, you'll also notice on the folder structure that these folders doesn't hold anything inside in there anymore. If I do enable those again, you'll see that the PCG graph will populate these with pack level actor components that fills up your outliner up here. So it always happens in the folder where the BP is located. Okay, just for managing file structures, that you know that it's what is going on. So I'm going to start with the normal BP VisusCity, drag and drop it. Or one other small thing again, and remember I do have the BP global variables that spawns all the road lines. I'm not going to turn it off and on now because it takes a while for the PCG graph to recalculate everything. But before you drag and drop, if you don't drop this in, you will not see road lines. You'll only see the road structures. If you create a road, you'll see that you don't have lines. You'll wonder why don't you have lines. It's this BP blueprint right here of global variable. It's got one variable. You can just drag and drop it into your scene and set the spawn road lines to be activated. That's just a small note. I'll repeat it back when we get to the roads part. So the BP VisusCity normal blueprint, if you drag and drop it in your level doesn't need to have a landscape as I do. As you'll see, my landscape has got a few hills right here. Once I drag and dropped it, it normally drops it depending on where my cursor was located, but ideally you would want it on the 0 axis on height wise. So you'll see now that this BP doesn't conform with the landscape. So that is to do with the setting of a project on landscape, yes or no. So once you've dropped your landscape, depending on if you want on a slab surface or not, in this case I want it on a landscape. So yes, so it will spawn the buildings and the houses onto the landscape. The buildings are represented by the blue blocks and the houses by the yellow blocks. So by pressing the G key, you can activate all the spline visualizations. So as you can see, I can move the whole spline around. The spline has got 4 vertices, 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices, and you can edit these vertices with the normal spline editing tools by, for instance, if I want to select that vertex, you double click the vertex, you can drag it, scale it, you can edit its tangent vertices, make it smaller, sharper, etc. One important note, which I do want to say, this is to do with Unreal Engine 5.4. I did mention this to the developers. They are aware of the problem. That when I wanted, with your spline editing tools, want to add a vertex, right? Which you normally do with, right here, I do Alt drag. You'll see your Unreal Engine will crash, as it has to do with that I'm using pack level actors and not static meshes, which they introduced in 5.4 methods of achieving this. So I'm just quickly going to show you the workaround on this. If you have your BP selected, I did put under VisusCity All, I did put a cleanup and a regenerate. So cleanup just cleans it up. I can edit my splines for now. So now I can, for instance, if I want to add an extra vertex, I can go Alt drag, I add the extra vertex. I can add as many vertices as I want to make the shape which I need. For instance, like let's say just to this area. I go back to the BPB VisusCity. Don't select the point. Make sure you're not into so I'm just going to work this out. Make sure you're not selected right there. You've got the BPB selected so that you have this menus again. So to make sure you have all these menus then, just because it can get a bit difficult to see what's going on. Little drop downs, VisusCity All. Remember, I did do a cleanup. Then I can just regenerate. Then it won't crash. Okay, so that's just a workaround. Hopefully, it will be fixed in version 5.5. But that's just a smallie. Yeah, so I'm going to go from here. We've done project on landscape, orientation. That's to do with if you go look at the curve line, top view, you'll see all the houses and all the buildings are orientated orthopedically right to left. If I turn orientation on, it conforms more to the curve of whatever your spline. You'll see the houses are curved and the buildings are curved according to the spline shape. That makes sense. Oh, spawn foliage, I can turn it back on because it is set up now just to use the dummies. So you'll see just dummy trees right there, which are the green ones. So you can turn that on or off. I prefer it not to be seen. So I'm going to leave this foliage off for now. Orientation, we've gone yes, and then sampling spacing. I'm sampling the spline, is to do with the spacing in between. If I make it bigger, you'll see it they get lots more distance between each object, and the default is 1000. Okay, so now pruning type is a little bit difficult to explain, as all these buildings and houses are the same sizes, each instance of each. So let me show you. I can turn on bounce all, which makes a little square to show the sizes. I'm going to disable the actors. So the bounce all and off just shows you the size, gives you an indication of the size of each element. Now printing type, if you hover over printing type, you'll see I've made a little list there that says large to small, and then small to large, 2 is all equal, and 3 is none. That has to do with the size. If I'm going to populate this with different actors, which has different bounce settings, because this is a bounce multiplier, scaling the bounce of each object up or down. Let me show you, for instance, if I reduce this bounce, it will become more dense because their bounce becomes smaller, and even more smaller, then I get a lot of buildings. If I actually enable the actors, you'll see that it's quite dense. And you'll get a lot of overlapping if you're gonna use real world actors. So I'm just gonna put the bounce back to 0. So getting back to pruning type, the best way, I'm just gonna disable that. So you'll see it's on 0, which means large to yes, large to small, which means it will spawn the larger objects first, even if a house is going to have quite a big bounce depending on the size of your house. It will first try and spawn the big uh, bounce first, and then populate the smaller where it has space. And then for pruning type, if I make it, it won't change anything because they're all pretty much the same size for this in the default setting. But yes, you can see if you put 1, it will put the smaller ones first, then the larger ones, and 3 it will make all equal. That's just for you to play around with. I'll try and get back to there once we've spawned actual meshes in here. To explain that part. So I think I've done all the properties, explained all the properties. I'm just going to turn on and off. So the bounce we'll use again once you spawn an actor, and you'll see if you've got a big house, for instance, you want to increase its bounce so it doesn't overlap with a neighboring house or not. That's the general settings that you can do under VisusCity. All drop down right here for each blueprint that you're going to use. So moving on to VisusCity Inner, drop down right here, you'll see a set of parameters for the inner sides. Now inner sides again is to do with the blue buildings. Zoom in. Okay, so inner distance, it's set to 15,000. It's the distance from the road or the edge that the buildings are spawned. If I increase this to say 25,000, you'll see they'll spawn more towards the middle of each section. It isn't spawned there because there's not enough space. If I decrease it to 5,000, for instance, it's right up the edge and there are no houses spawned. Similar to my dense building blueprint setup right for that side of the city. Okay, so I'm setting it back to its default. So that's the distance between that. Inner density is to do with how many buildings are spawned. It can only go up to 1. So if I set it less and less, you'll see less and less buildings are spawned. But the distance is kept, so as you can see. So you've got your houses and stuff. So it goes all the way up to 1. The inner height scale has to do with the further it becomes from the edge, the more higher they will become into the center. The default is 1, which that means it doesn't scale at all. If I say set this for 5, you'll see the buildings in the center gets a lot taller than the buildings on the edge of the area which it is spawning. Now, I've created my buildings. They're just general exterior buildings. So this is an important note, which means they can be scaled up and down and look fairly okay. But you can't really do this with a real life building because it will still keep the amount of floors if you have a real building, and it will basically just stretch all those floors according to amount. So when you are using real life buildings, you rather do not want to scale them up or down, and then rather use their real actual sizes to populate. So this is more for if you're doing a fantasy type of projects, you know, like a very futuristic type of project. It is possible to do that. And then the inner right skull clamp is also to do, if I make this 10, it clamps from the distance. You'll need a big area to show, but I'm not going to delete roads now. But it clamps from where this multiplication must start happening to, because I don't think on this small one, yeah, you can see it. So there you can see, okay, it's clamped it a bit more to the center. So those two goes hand in hand together. And then I'm just going to set this back to its default. Inner reduction, you'll not see it now because they are pretty sparse. So let me rather do the inner bounce. That, remember, has to do with, it's a multiplier that multiplies the bounce of your, remember the bounce all is already multiplied by 0.7. If I activate a bounce, you'll see those little bound indicators. And if I set this to less, you'll see it gets more dense. So this doesn't affect the houses, it's only for the inner. So I'm going to make it even more dense, just for the tutorial purpose, to explain what happens to the the density reduction. So if I put this to 1, it tries to reduce the density. Whatever you have, it tries to reduce the density even more, but on a random set of. So they are quite dense, but it reduces the density, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to put the bounce back to its normal. Inner seed is your randomization of your buildings, but because I'm using the same dummy object, you won't see the difference if I change the inner seed. This has to do if you have different buildings, so it will replace this building with another building. So I can set the seeds. It's a randomization. Once we populate it with the actors, you'll see the difference. That's to do with the inner seed. The same is going to do with the 90-degree rotates. We won't see it. Okay, so yeah, that just basically rotates randomly, yes or no. If it turns on, all your buildings will, the same buildings will, all of them will face the same way. And then this rotates them 90 degrees randomly each spawn object. You won't see much because I'm using the dummy object. Your transform inner minimum and inner maximum is your minimum and maximum transformations of each object randomly on the inner buildings. So again, very important, as I mentioned with the inner height scale, if you are using real world buildings, you do not want to scale them at all and use their actual sizes, you're going to have to just set these scales. You'll see you've got location, rotation, random, minimum and maximums. You'll see mine is on the X, Y, and Z 0.7 and the X, Y, and Z maximums are 1.5. So if you want to keep your buildings to not scale at all, if you are using real world objects, you'll have to want to put these to 111 on the scales of Z, as well as your inner height scale, because now it's also, you'll see the ones towards the center is taller. The inner height scale you also want to put to 0. Then you've got only, there's no transformation on the scale of your buildings. Again, if you've got for instance, a procedural content generated building that has a certain amount of floors and it's got interiors inside, you do not want to apply any transformations. You want to use the building as is with its scale in that regards. But if you want to create fantasy, futuristic type of buildings where they can be scaled and you're only using the exteriors, this, like I've done in my project, you can play with these minimum and maximum values there. You'll see on the houses I do not scale them. And that is the transform inner and outer maximum. Now it's the fun part, which I just have to try and find the blueprint again. Yes, sorry guys, the window is a bit small there. Inner actors. This is a array, list of array. I've got 5 members in here. Sorry, I've only got one element here, which is this blue building. And it's an array, and I've got a scale which I can set here. The priority, I can add another building. It works like VisusCity Volume 1, kind of like the list of array elements. So I've left this inner actors to use only the dummies, and then data assets we can use to use your own assets or buildings. I've set it up like this so that you can choose which way you do want to use. For instance, you'll see one thing that has changed. I'm not using static meshes. Each one is using a packed level actor instead of a static mesh. So if I want to add another element, for instance, I can add, for instance, another packed level actor here. It will default to the blue dummy. Let me go, for instance, I've got my buildings, I've got my pack level actors here. Let me drag and drop one pack level actor, for instance, here, that building. So you'll see now I'll have some of them is the blue dummy and some of them is this building I've put here. Right. So you can use either or in that regards, like the original VisusCity method. Filling up that array up here. Alright, so you add your elements or delete the elements unlimited. So I'm just going to delete this element. Right, so it's just the blue actors again, dummy actors. And that's where you will do like the original VisusCity if you want to just populate, add your pack level actors, add or remove as such. But I tend to want to keep this dummies here for visualization purposes. And then this is the part where you can then quickly replace it with with whatever dollar asset you have set up. Okay, I've just because if I accidentally quickly click outside, I struggle to find my VisusCity. I just an outlier I just added VisusCity so I can select the blueprint right there just quickly. What I wanted to say, for instance, as well is, yeah, the scales, as you can imagine, that's your normal scale. So if I can make it 2, they are bigger and they're smaller. Priority, okay, they're all 1 index, but that's the amount of priority one gets. They all will get if you add them on, they all get a priority of 1. If I make one building, say a priority of 10, it will spawn 10 times more than the other actors. So that's your basic priority. And this is just a bounce which I want to clarify, because these settings you'll also get in the data assets. So if I want to visualize just the bounds only, for instance, because as you can see, my bound is sort of those little blocks are the bounds, and this is the building. The bounds are quite the same size as the object itself. But when you have a building, an odd shaped building, if you let's say a rectangular shaped building, for each asset you can go and change the bounce levels, for instance, and say, no, some of them have a bounce like bounce shape like that, a rectangular shape, as you can see, so that way they don't overlap each other when they spawn. So that's where you will change your bounds X and Y for the shapes for your buildings as well as your homes. You've got a similar setup like that. All right. So that's how you will visualize your bounds. You go to VisusCity All, you can show right the bounds, right there temporarily. So make sure you've got your bounce size set up for each asset. Hope that helps. So that is using your normal inner actors. Then when I switch this on or off, it won't use this, right? It won't use the inner actors. Then it will, if I turn on use inner data assets, it will use the data asset. So I've got one data asset. I can browse to that data asset here. You'll see I've only got one building actors called DA building actors, for data asset building actors. And in this asset, I've added all the 1 to 11 buildings. The tower is separate. It's not inside. So it's only the 1 to 11 buildings I've added into that data asset. So if I turn this on, it will not use the inner actors. So this is not applicable anymore. It will use the data asset, which uses the 11 buildings that I set up. So by editing the data asset, you can double click right there, or you can browse towards it here and double click it there. You'll see the data asset is similar to that arrays. I've got 11 indexes, 11 indexes, array indexes. Each of them is the same. I've got the which pack level actor does it want to use. So for the buildings, pack level actors, you can drag and drop your pack level actor here. Whichever building you've got, your own level, you can create your own level and make it a pack level actor, drag and drop them. And then same things, you set the scale, the priority, and the bounds X and Y inside your data asset. And then you can save them as a separate data asset, which you would prefer. Okay, the VisusCity outer works actually exactly the same as the inner. It's just less complicated because the inner I did want to do the scaling of the towards the center and scale them much more randomly for the intersections. Let me go back to dummies. Close down the inner and open outer. You'll see it's the same, basically the same parameters, just a lot less. Same principles, it's your density if I make it 0.1. So now the yellows, we're working with the outer, the yellow objects, much less houses. If I reduce, let's make it back to 1, the density 1 is the maximum. If I reduce the bounds, they also become even more dense. So just the houses, they become more dense. Same principle as the inner things, and also random rotates 90 degrees, also random transformations, but with here you'll see the default it's 1 to 1 to 1. I do not transform my houses because they're kind of going to be real world actors where you want to put in furniture, pieces, interiors, and you do not want to scale them. And yes, in the same principle with the dummy actors, I can use the actors or I can use the data assets, which is the 12 houses I've added inside. So just give it a minute. Populate. I've got a lot of houses now. I've made a big made a oopsie. So just give it a second. All right. Now that's not what you want to do before you actually just activate your data assets because you might have a bit too many houses which are overlapping, as you can see now. But this is a use case scenario of what not to do. So I'm just gonna the bounds, outer bounds, the density. I think I've put it. Oh, it's the bounds. So back to 1. Just give it a second. Okay. All right. So there we got the houses, 12 houses spawning randomly, basically everywhere. I've designed these houses with this on a flat surface so that if you are on a hill, they are spawned on a hill, they are spawned with a certain wall. Just try not. So as you can imagine, you don't want to make your hills too tall or too steep, or spawn your houses on a too steep of hill. Rather, if you're designing homes or houses for your project, yeah. Um, I think that's the gist of the inner and the outers. I can explain to you. So if I can activate the inners again, so I don't want to use the dummies. I want to use the data asset, and maybe they're too dense. So I'll say okay, the density I say I can make it 0.5, bit less dense buildings, even less like 0.1. And so you can play forth, back and forth until you get the balance that you want to achieve for your visualization. Okay, so then the last one is your foliage. Okay, to see the foliage, of course, you'll need to activate the foliage, spawn the foliage. It will do the dummy actors at first. So each foliage, it basically takes each point from each house or building and just generates random points around each and create a dummy point at first, or the points are generated there for where your actors will spawn. Okay, so on the foliage, the area size, that is to do with the distance from each house. So, but remember now, it will cut out the roads. There is a certain distance that I have set up for don't go close to a road. For the more advanced users, you can set that is not in a parameter, but if you do want to feel that the trees are a bit too far from the road, or you want to move them closer to the road, etc., you would want to go to the main PCG graph of VisusCity. You'll see, for instance, the cutout areas I've set up here on a certain distance. Here I sample the cutout paths, which is all the roads, and here areas is all the areas. The areas is, for instance, the pond. That is an area cutout that I've done. Shouldn't spawn buildings or houses. I've done another one here for there. Don't spawn buildings or houses. Even under the tower, don't spawn buildings and houses. For instance, that's the cutout areas, and then cutout paths, as I say. So this is a spline sampler, but you can play with these values. There's 2000 values. If you make them less, your buildings and houses will go closer. That is for the buildings part. The foliage part here, you'll see I've got another setup right here. I've made them separate. It's similar, exactly the same setup, but I've made it a little less, 1000 by 1500, to cut out the foliage rather, so that the foliage is going to be a bit more closer to the roads, etc. But that is more for advanced users if you want to go there. So that's your area size, which means it's 3000 by 3000 around each building or house. If I make it smaller, you'll actually notice. Then they become more clamped towards they spawn more towards the inner side. You don't even see them now because they get cut out as well. They get pruned from the house. 1500. Hey, okay, 3000. Let's publish 3000. Okay, 2000 by 2000. You'll see they get a bit more closer to the buildings, but they also get pruned, cut out. If the building is in the way, they also get cut out. But now all the trees are a bit more closer to the buildings. We want them further from the buildings. My default is 3000. The cell size, this controls how many there are. The smaller the number, the more trees. Okay, so if it's a bigger number, the less trees, right? less trees. I don't want to go too much. Okay, I'm still on damage, so I can go a bit more. So if I go 1000, you'll see it's a lot of trees. You'll just have to be careful on depending on which PC you are using. If you make the number too small, you can cause a crash, especially when you populate it with the data assets. Okay, so the default is 2000. Oh, that is not supposed to be there. Oh no, that is supposed to, sorry, that is supposed to be there. Scale building bounds, so that's the distance from the building. So basically it multiplies the bounds of the building. So if I multiply it by 2, the trees will only spawn further away from each building. Okay, so that's a way to also make sure they don't spawn too close to your buildings. Okay, I haven't worked on that for a while, so I was a bit confused. Back to 1. And then your foliage seed is also randomization. You won't see it unless, I'm just going to go quickly, same as the inner and outers, you've got your transform inner and maximums. You'll see that I've put the trees basically 1-to-1 scale, minimum, and then up to 5 each tree. Foliage actor can be 5 times randomly. It's under Z, yeah, scale 1 to 5 basically. You see X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z. And then same as the inner and outers, I've got my foliage meshes which uses the dummy actor right here. Unless I say no, I want to use the data asset, same principle as the inner and outer, and then populates with the 10 tree assets. The only difference is with the foliage is that you'll notice the data asset of the foliage doesn't use packed level actors, but it uses static meshes. I've set it up like that because your assets that you normally buy for foliage, like mega scans, all that, are normally static meshes, which you can drag and drop here. So you'll see under my foliage, I've got static meshes right there. I've also got the foliage types there, but I've got static meshes actors, unlike the buildings where I've got packed level actors, which are levels. Right. So you can exchange these foliage static meshes actors, add it with any foliage library you've got, drag and drop your static mesh in here, and you've got your scale and priority of each, and add as many trees that you want to add or not add to your library. And then, of course, there's a lot of other developers that have methods of how to generate different parts of foliage or different methods. And so again, if you want to reverse engineer the PCG graph, you can see from the main level. I've also color coded it. If I go back to dummy levels, I just want to set up my don't spawn. Let's say, okay, I'll keep the foliage. Okay, I don't spawn the data assets there. And for the outer, I also don't want to use the data assets. I just want to use the dummies. And the inner also not data assets, just the dummies. So color coordination I did make. You'll see the graph according to so the yellows you'll see is all the house graph procedures, call it that. I'm not actually a developer, but so my wording might be a bit wrong. And the blue parts are for the building parts. And you'll see up to a point I get to where I say I want to do the foliage, so I use not the cutouts, the foliage part. You'll see I'm using a named reroute node that goes to the foliage generation part. So this part you can customize as well for the foliage generation on a different way of if you want to do very advanced foliage generation for your own project. Guys, okay, I actually forgot just a few small things in regards to again the distance towards the roads. If you do not want to use the PCG graphs and go edit, you can actually. I'll cover this more in the roads part. But for the road elements, for instance, you can go and change you'll see that is the bounding distance that each road element has, for instance. So you can go actually on the vertex, for instance, select the vertex of each road, and you can scale down, up or down, use the R button to switch to scale mode, and you can scale the bounding distance of each section, and then you'll see the houses and the trees will spawns more closer to the road, um, and of course you just have to check that your trees doesn't spawn inside the road or the house doesn't spawn over the road for each section if you want to manually just change certain boundaries from the roads. And that's the one thing. Then the other thing I want to mention, just for last sake, is on the homes. I'm just going to turn on the house actors. You'll see, as I mentioned, remember the pruning type is set large to small. So the last two houses that I did are these two big houses. That's this one and that one. You'll see they are getting spawned much more because the pruning type is set from large to small. Right. The last thing I did want to mention is the houses from 1 to 10 is from VisusCity 1, which is the older houses all there. They're just for exteriors and best viewed from a distance, more for your from medium to far range distance in the background. You'll see they're quite low poly. They do have exteriors. The windows are set up to be mirrors, so you can't really see inside. But they do have some interiors. Okay, you won't see now because no light is coming inside them. But the new houses, the two new homes that I've done is this one. And these trees are actually inside the level. So that's the plus side of starting to use back level actors. So these homes, they are external only, but they do have internals which you can populate with furniture. I am busy with this house. It's got a kitchen area here, which I will update eventually on this model, but you can go crazy on this model and populate with yourself. Here's, for instance, a living room. That's the garage area. I don't have any lights inside, just to keep it small. It's got 4 bedrooms, in the upper floor space for 4 great bedrooms, a walk-in closet, etc., etc. Actually made a infinity pool above a pool, which I think is pretty cool, if you guys ask me. And yeah, so as you can see, there's an infinity pool. And yeah, so you can get quiet if I activate everything on. So I need my foliage actors. Need all my foliage actors on. Need my what am I missing? What am I missing? Oh, the inner buildings. I need the actors on. Okay, so now I've got my basically, yeah, there's a view from the infinity pool for this house. So as you can see, there's quite a lot you can do with this as a starting point for your own project. I hope you guys are happy, and if any questions, leave them in the comments. And if you've bought my product, thank you very much for supporting me. I will be continuing with this project. In between my freelance jobs, I will be continuing to improve these, and I'm welcome for any suggestions on what you might think will need improvement. And thank you again. Enjoy your day.